All right, let's start. So hello and welcome everyone to our introductory webinar on human rights due diligence. My name is Alice and I lead the thematic programs within the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Very happy to see so many people joining today. Happy to acknowledge your interest. We're very pleased to offer this webinar today as part of our collaboration with the Swiss Federal Administration and with Focus Rights to promote the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The objective of our network is to draw the attention of companies to the relevance of social and environmental issues for their activities and to support them in the implementation of responsible practices. So at the Global Compact, we encourage dialogue and knowledge exchange between experts and companies through various learning and dialogue formats, such as today's webinar. We support companies to, on one hand, act responsibly on the 10 principles, and on the other hand, to promote innovative solutions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So as shown on the slide that you see in front of you, 6 of the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact are related to human and labor rights. Thus, the UN Global Compact asks companies to respect and support internationally proclaimed human rights and to ensure that they are not involved in any human rights abuses throughout their value chain. In this spirit, I'm very much looking forward to today's event and would like to warmly thank Anna Sandi from the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Jolinka Vossen and Matthias Leisinger from Focus Rights for the excellent collaboration. And now I give the floor to Matthias. Have a nice webinar.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thanks also from our side to Global Compact team and also to Anna from FDFA. So also welcome to all of you participated this afternoon, and we are looking forward to present you today on human rights due diligence. And yes, there was already a question in the chat. We will share all the slides afterwards with you as part of the documentation pack. This session will also be recorded and made available on the website of the Global Compact. So if you're interested in even looking at it again afterwards, you can do this by doing so. So today we will address the following questions after a short introduction from Anna Sandi from the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. We will look into what are the international and national regulatory developments in the field of human rights due diligence, look a little bit into what are the requirements for companies in Switzerland, briefly also look into Germany, the European Union, and then in a second part, in more details, look into what are the elements of human rights due diligence, how can you implement human rights due diligence, what is required in the international frameworks, have a sort of a deep dive on risk assessments. We'll do a short kind of role play on how companies can identify and prioritize human rights risks, and then also have a short introduction how companies can start with a specific focus also on SMEs. We will have 2 blocks of Q&A sessions, but also encourage you to ask your questions. Meanwhile, we are presenting in the chat, so you can use the chat function, and we will try to take up your questions and certainly have time in the Q&A sessions in the middle and at the end of today's webinar. As already mentioned, this session is being recorded. Make sure that you are being muted during the webinar so that we can avoid background noises. And again, use the chat function if you have a question, a comment, and then we will take this up. As mentioned by Alice, this is a webinar hosted and supported and funded by the Swiss government. So thanks a lot also from our side to FDFA and SECO for supporting this project in terms of awareness raising in line with the Swiss National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And in this context, I would like to hand over to Anna Sandi from FDFA for a short introduction on the expectations of the government. Anna Sandi is a Human Rights Policy Officer within FDFA. So please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matthias, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Anna Sandi, and I'm part of the Business and Human Rights team at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. This webinar today is organized based on the mandate of the Federal Council, because the Federal Council attaches really great importance to responsible business conduct and is convinced that this is actually also a prerequisite for sustainable social and economic development. So maybe to begin with the international framework, so those are actually the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. They have been adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2011 and are recognized internationally, even though they're not a legally binding document in this sense. So, but they really define the complementary roles of states and business in protecting human rights in the context of economic activities. And to translate this international framework into practice at national level, the federal administration has developed a national action plan. So the first one has been adopted by the Federal Council in 2016, and there is a new national action plan which has been adopted 2020, which is also covering the period right now until 2023. So it contains around 35 measures and it's really meant to protect human rights in the context of these economic activities by the federal government as well as Swiss companies. Through the National Action Plan, the Federal Council is also supporting business enterprises. So, for example, through the creation of tools and such as guidelines, or organizing events and trainings such as the webinar today. And finally, the NAP is also an instrument for coordinating action between the different actors involved and contributes to more synergies and more policy coherence. So, in order to achieve the goals of the National Action Plan, the Federal Council has its clear expectation. So he expects that business enterprises based in Switzerland or operating in Switzerland fulfill their human rights responsibilities wherever they operate and to carry out human rights due diligence. So Swiss companies must ensure that their business operations have no negative human rights impact. But the good thing is that it's not only about expectations, but it's also about advantages. So actually, having a human rights due diligence process offers many strategic advantages to you. So, for example, improved reputation and greater resilience. As you know, like human rights abuses, they are very fast picked up by social media, and finally they really address the consumers. So actually analyzing the risks in your value chain and abiding by human rights really contributes also to your reputation management. And greater resilience in the sense towards more legislation, because as you know, at the international level, there's an increasing trend toward more human rights due diligence requirements, be it at EU level or the member countries of the EU. And this legislation will also affect Swiss companies. So actually, by introducing this human rights due diligence processes, you will be more resilient also to legislation, but also towards crisis, in particular if you're operating in fragile context. Then enhanced productivity and product quality. So I think good working relations go hand in hand with better or enhanced productivity and better product quality. There is less accidents, higher satisfaction, and at the end, this translates into better quality of your products or services. There's an increased employer attractiveness because actually employees carry, they really care more about values, and I think corporate culture that is based on human rights, they might really, the businesses might really attract well-skilled workers. And finally, increased competitiveness. This means that, as I already said, there is a higher, business and governments, they have expectations, and if you can really meet these expectations, you're considered as a reliable partner, and this can really open you the door to new funding and also to export credits and so on. So I think we all agree that human rights are important, but of course there's a lot of questions about how to introduce this human rights due diligence process. So again, in order to support you, the federal administration has set up an information platform. This is an information platform that is operated by the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs and the State Secretariat for Economy. So there you will find a lot of documentation and different tools, different guidelines, and you will find also the contacts. So if you have any inquiries, you please contact us. There is an email in there, and yes, so we are really happy to respond to your questions and also to your needs. And yes, I'm about at the end now of the presentation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really wish you a lot of success in your business activities and projects and in the introduction of human rights due diligence. Thank you very much. Back to you, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction and setting the frame and context. And with this, I would like to hand over to my colleague Jolenka, who's also here today, and set a little bit the scene on what are the international standards, the regulatory developments, what are expectations in the context of human rights due diligence, Anna already mentioned. So Jolenka, can you set us a little bit the scene and the context to start with?
Yes, thank you, Matthias. So as Anna already mentioned, in generally, we can see that the expectations are rising towards companies to conduct their business in a socially responsible way, and there are rising expectations from many different actors. For example, civil society organizations, they conduct research and run campaigns on human rights violations in international value chains, and benchmarks and rating agencies such as the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark or Noted Chain assess the human rights performance of companies and then publish their results. Investors also demand transparency from companies and increasingly invest according to sustainability criteria. Then from the side of business partners and consumers, we can also see that sustainability and human rights are becoming increasingly important criteria, for example, in purchasing via supplier code of conduct or sector initiatives such as Amphori or EcoVadis. In general, here, human rights due diligence is really becoming a matter of business continuity, also in B2B and public procurement. And then consumers, nothing new. They're also looking at the reputation of companies in terms of sustainability. And then lastly, there's also rising pressure from governments and regulatory bodies. We'll have a look at that in a moment. The bottom line of all those expectations is really that human rights due diligence and responsible business conduct is increasingly moving from a nice to have to a must have. And if we look at what is behind all those expectations, what is being expected of companies, in its essence, as Anna already mentioned, it's about the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And among all the expectations, the primary thing that is required of companies to respect to fulfill their responsibility is to conduct the so-called human rights due diligence. And this concept of human rights due diligence was adopted in the so-called UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 2011 by the UN Human Rights Council. And since 2011, they've become the most important international standard for business and human rights. The OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises that you can also see on the slides, they're also aligned with the so-called UNGPs. And those two standards really form the basis for many regulatory initiatives or also sector initiatives on the topic of human rights. The Swiss National Action Plan, as Anna Sandy mentioned before, you can see it on the right side. This also really aims to raise the awareness of the UN Guiding Principles and to promote their implementation in the Swiss business community. Now, I mentioned the rising pressure from the side of governments and regulatory bodies before. Let's have a look at that more closely. I brought you an overview of the worldwide developments in the field of business and human rights. And what you can see here is that it is really a global issue and the requirements for companies are increasing on all continents. In beige, you can see those countries that are either currently developing a national action plan or have already adopted one in dark beige. And then in green, we've highlighted those countries that have passed a law on human rights due diligence. And here, the darker the country, the more comprehensive is the law and also the higher are the requirements for companies. You can find this map with also links to the respective laws on our website, and we regularly update that one also. Now, I want to specifically highlight two developments, and that is the ones in Germany and the EU. In Germany, some of you might already know it, there is the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act in place, the so-called Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz. And that one will come into force from 2023 for companies with over 3,000 employees. And then 1 year later from 2024 for companies with more than 1,000 employees. And this law is also relevant for foreign companies that have a branch in Germany with a correspondent number of employees. And the requirements of this law, as the name already says, it focuses on the supply chain. And roughly speaking, it's about the implementation of important core elements of the UNGPs. For example, it requires companies to have a policy commitment, to conduct a risk analysis, to take measures, and also to report on the implementation. Now, on the level of the European Union, I also want to highlight one important development that was also mentioned before already. There is a debate at the moment going on at EU level on mandatory human rights due diligence. And in February this year, the EU Commission published a draft European law on corporate due diligence for the environment and human rights. And this law, as it is currently proposed, would apply to all companies with more than 500 employees and to companies with more than 250 employees if they operate in high-risk sectors. In terms of content, the law is very close to the Responsible Business Initiative on which Switzerland voted in 2020. And it's still a draft. It may take several years until the final law is passed. It will now go to the EU Parliament, but that's certainly a very important development to have in mind. Now, moving on to Switzerland, what is the development there, Matthias? Can you give us an overview of what we need to know regarding the requirements here?
Thank you, Jorinka, for the introduction and a little bit European and worldwide context. Now, looking a little bit closer into Switzerland and the counter proposal to the responsible business initiative and the respective ordinance on due diligence and transparency that actually entered into force at the beginning of this year. So what are the requirements in Switzerland? So basically there are new requirements in, call them 3 subject areas. One is the non-financial reporting, laying out, describing reporting obligations on non-financial matters in the areas of environment, social affair, labor, human rights, and corruption. Then there's a second pillar, which is the due diligence and transparency obligations in the area of child labor. And the third element is the due diligence and transparency obligations in the area of conflict minerals. For all of those 3 areas, there is a sanction mechanism in the event of a violation of the reporting obligations. In those 3 areas, there's basically the potential that the company can be fined up to 100,000 Swiss francs. But that's very brief an overview on those 3 areas, and I will now briefly look into those new obligations a little bit more detail. Probably to start with a short disclaimer also from our side. The information we are sharing here is based on our own understanding, so it's Focusrite's interpretation and understanding. It does not always necessarily reflect the view of the authorities and is not official information. So I think that's important to highlight right at the beginning. So when we look into the reporting obligations, those new reporting requirements in Switzerland are mainly based on the EU's CSR directive. So the non-financial reporting directive, which was adopted in 2014, it has been in force since 2017, and a lot of you might know that this is currently already under revision and will be published sooner or later in a new and adapted version. The scope of application in Switzerland concerns large public companies, so that means listed companies, as well as large financial institutions that are subject to FINMA regulations that exceed certain thresholds in 2 consecutive years, as outlined on the slide. And not in scope are companies that are already covered by equivalent reporting, e.g. because the parent company reports or in another country, or same in Switzerland, or because they are already required to prepare an equivalent reporting under another regulation in another country. Important, I think, what is important here to note is that there are new formal requirements that are relevant for companies. So it is an annual reporting that needs to be signed off by the highest management or administrative body of the companies, including the board of directors. They must sign the report. So there is much more board accountability in the whole process, and the report must be approved by the General Assembly. So you can see that it is moving much more towards more accountability from a traditional CSR reporting that companies could potentially publish in June or July. And now you also have to adapt your reporting cycles. So you have to publish a report that needs to be approved by the AGM. So I think that's certainly something that needs to be considered now when implementing those new reporting obligations. In terms of content, the counter proposal specifies 5 topics that must be reported on, and the content also must be covered in each of the topics areas. I already mentioned them. You can see them again on the left side of the slide. What we hear quite often is then the question, yeah, if my company would already do a GRI reporting or follow another standard, is this then already compliant with the regulation in Switzerland? We believe that certainly GRI and certainly the revised version of the GRI standards are a good reference for non-financial reporting in terms of content. In order to fulfill the requirements of the law, however, on the other hand, the formal criteria must still be fulfilled. So the adoption of the highest body, the publication, so all the formal criteria we just have looked before. But we believe that in terms of content, GRI is certainly a good reference. But nevertheless, I think the 5 topics required in law in terms of content, they must be defined as salient issues according to GRI in order to be covered by the reporting. So you cannot choose and pick your topics because the regulation in Switzerland describes those 5 topics that needs to be addressed. Then looking into the second element in terms of child labor due diligence, so which companies are in the scope here and what is child labor. The law refers here to the International Labor Organization's definition of abusive child labor. So simply said, the minimum age for the employment of minors must be not less than 50 years, and work must not be less than minors must not be less than 15 years, and work must not prevent the child from attending school. So again, here the reference to international standards. And obviously it is very important that special protective conditions apply to work, which is dangerous and hazardous to health. So again, here what we quite often hear is the question, yeah, if a child is working out in a farm or in a restaurant, in Switzerland or elsewhere, is this child labor? And according to the definition, obviously, we have to look into, but if a child is helping out on a Swiss farm, it is usually not abusive child labor as defined by the international norms and regulations. Which companies have to implement human rights due diligence and report on it? So who is in scope? The due diligence and reporting obligations apply to all companies that are offering products and services where there is a so-called reasonable ground for suspicion that they have produced or provided using child labor. And I will just come back to this in a minute, how you would define reasonable grounds for suspicions. So there is a multi-step process to find out if company, or if you are as a company covered by the child labor due diligence obligations. The first step is basically the exception for SMEs. So the first question you need to look into is that...
J'ai commandé, mais je crois que j'ai fait une bêtise.
Could you please mute yourself?
J'ai pas fait attention, c'est un lot de 2 coussins. Et j'ai...
Thank you. So the first step is basically looking into the exception for SMEs, which means that if you have a balance sheet of 20 million, certain sales revenue of 40 million, and less than 250 full-time employees, that's the first exception. So here, SMEs would not be usually in scope if they have less than 250 employees. In the second step, then you have to check in terms of a risk classification to make sure that you do not source from countries that have high risks in terms of child labor. And how do you do this? So you are using the UNICEF Workplace Index and check whether the products or services you source are coming from medium or high-risk countries according to the UNICEF index. And just to give an example here again, if you're sourcing products and services from the US, for example, which is, to my knowledge, a medium-risk country, you have then to do the third step, which is go into your supply chain and check whether there is a well-founded suspicion of child labor for the specific product and service. So is there concrete and documented evidence for child labor in your supply chain? So that sounds already quite complicated. To make it a little bit more complicated even more, there is a so-called counter exception. So if you do not fall in the scope of when you did the first 3 steps, if there is obvious use of child labor, that also includes SMEs. That means if there's, for example, a concrete court ruling, or clear evidence that there has been child labor in a supply chain, then you would still fall in the scope of this due diligence regulation in Switzerland, and that would also apply for smaller companies with less than 250 employees. The good news is somehow that there is an alternative to the implementation of the legal obligations, which means that you can apply internationally recognized sets of rules, as Jolinka but also Anna have described them at the beginning. So that is, for example, the OECD guidance and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in combination with the ILO tool. So if you would choose to conduct due diligence according to those international standards, then you're exempted from the legal obligations under the ordinance in Switzerland. And what this means and what this entails, we will talk about it in the second part of the webinar. Then the third element are the conflict minerals. I don't want to go into too much details here, but it's a similar approach as we've seen with child labor, and it's very much aligned with the EU regulation on conflict minerals that defines tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold containing minerals or metals from conflict and high-risk areas as conflict minerals. So here the Swiss regulation is very much aligned to the EU regulation on conflict mineral, again with certain specifications. Again here, the question, which companies are in scope? So basically companies of all sizes that import minerals and metals above certain thresholds into Switzerland or process them in Switzerland are affected by the regulation. So that's the first step. And then the second step would be to check whether these minerals and materials are considered as conflict minerals. So you have to find out the origin of the materials that must be verified. Again, here you can make use of the so-called alternative, instead applying the Swiss regulation. Again, here you can you can use the exemption from the legal obligations by applying international standards. I think that's very brief in terms of conflict minerals, which is the third element here look into. So that is just to find out whether you are in scope or not. So you can see that's already quite a lot of work you would have to do. And then if you are in scope of those new obligations in Switzerland, basically the work begins or continues, looking into what needs to be done. So on one hand, there are the due diligence and reporting requirements, which means that companies must implement a supply chain or a management system related to conflict minerals and or child labors. That entails, for example, comprehensive supply chain policy, a system for traceability in the supply chain, continuous and ongoing risk assessment on negative impacts in the supply chain, including also the reporting procedures, concrete risk management plan, and mitigating measures to minimize identified risks. And again here, the question of transparency. So you have to publish an annual report on compliance with those due diligence regulations. What are the formal requirements in Switzerland? So you can, again, the responsibility for reporting on those due diligence obligations is within the top management of the governing body. So again, it's the executive board, the board of directors, and the AGM. In terms of conflict minerals, there is an audit requirement. So you have to make an audit and ensure that you are compliant with the due diligence regulations in with regards to conflict minerals. So you need to have an external audit by a recognized auditing firm for conflict minerals. This is not the case for child labor. So I think that's probably the most important difference in those two due diligence and reporting mechanisms on child labor and on conflict minerals. We have compiled 2 background papers, not necessarily addressing all the details of the regulation, but just to give you a little bit more information on what is child labor, how it can be implemented in terms of due diligence, but also similar in terms of conflict minerals. They can be downloaded and found on our website free of charge. So that's a little bit the context in Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So we heard now that companies are currently confronted with a situation in which a variety of laws are being passed in a similar subject area, as we saw on the world map before. Now, for me, the question comes up, how should companies deal with these different requirements? I mean, a company cannot really introduce X different processes on the same topic for different laws. That sounds very complicated to me. And for Switzerland, Matthias, you mentioned this exception to apply the international standards. What's your experience there? Is this exception to apply the international standards very complicated? Is it a big effort, or what do you suggest companies should do in light of all these different laws?
I think what we quite often hear in this discussion with companies is that they always have the impression that the exception applying UNGPs and OECD in its entirety is the Mercedes of due diligence. But when we look a little bit in more detail, what companies need to do just to understand whether they are in scope of the regulations, for example, in terms of child labor due diligence in Switzerland. So the steps I have presented, those 3 steps, they have to be done annually. So depending on actually how the company is structured, how many products and services you source, you have in the second step, for example, 150 or 200 products, or even thousands and 10,000s of products, you have to conduct this assessment where the products are sourced from, with the workplace index is coming from UNICEF. So that's an annual work you have to do. So that's already a lot of administration work coming up. And then the second step is that you have then, or the second argument we quite often hear is that, okay, then we have to do a full traceability of the products and services we source, which again can be very challenging, as most of you might know, trying to establish a traceability system. So by using actually the OECD and UNGPs, you can much more use a risk-based approach. And there's, for example, no requirement on traceability. So depending actually on the size of the context, depending on your supply chain, on how many products and services you source, it might make absolutely sense to make use of this exemption. Even more, as you can see here, is that the legal developments abroad are also relevant for Swiss companies. So Jolinka presented the law in Germany. There are other laws coming up or already being established. So if you're, as Switzerland, an exporting country and an exporting company, I think it is very important that you also have in mind what you have to comply with in a B2B sector. So suppliers of the company concerned in Germany, so if you're sourcing or if you're supplying to Siemens, for example, you just have to comply with the standards Siemens sets out in its tender processes. And again, as Jolinka mentioned, it's becoming a question of business continuity. So what we quite often see is that it makes sense to use international standards as basis for the due diligence, because the majority of the laws out there in Switzerland, in Germany, in France, but also the new law being discussed on a European level is based on the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines. And that's why certainly if companies are operating in an international context, having somehow complex value chains and supply chains. So we often recommend that it's simpler, it's more efficient, it's much more impactful to establish a due diligence process that is aligned to international standards. And then you just have to make sure that you complement additional requirements in the different laws. As for example, there are very specific requirements in the German law in terms of policies or human rights policies that you just have covered these laws. But using international standards as a basis for due diligence makes certainly sense for a lot of companies that are operating in an international context. And that's what we often also hear from our clients, is that you're very well positioned and prepared for regulatory developments if you adhere to those international standards. We will now describe in more details in the second part. Good. Are there any specific questions to the regulations coming up?
Yes, Matthias, there is a question from Sila. She is asking if the use of CMRT templates for collecting supplier-related data and also the membership in Responsible Minerals Initiative, for example, would be enough to say you're compliant. And also if the OECD guideline exception, if you apply the exception, you would still need to get audited by an external audit company. So there are the two questions.
Probably, the first one, I would say that collecting data does not replace a comprehensive human rights due diligence. So it can be an element of human rights due diligence. It can be used for identifying risks in your supply chain, but it's certainly also a good tool then for implementing follow-up measures. But basically what you're doing is collecting data, and collecting data does not yet replace human rights due diligence. So it's an element for risk assessment and potentially for implementing certain measures so that you have also more targeted full communication potentially supply chain, but it does not replace a complete human rights due diligence. Then the RME, I think again here it is we see quite often that when companies have limited leverage or influence in their supply chain, in taking targeted measures, that working with multi-stakeholder initiatives can help in order to increase the leverage at the end. And the resources RMI is publishing, again, I think it can help, again, here to implement the OECD guidelines. And as far to my understanding and knowledge, there has also been close collaboration between the two organizations. So again, here I think it's a good tool to use in terms of implementing human rights due diligence without kind of covering the full framework. And then the question on audit. To be honest, I don't know 100%. I believe, I'm not sure if somebody else in the group knows, but I would think probably that you also would need under the EU regulation an audit on conflict minerals, but we would have to cross-check, to be honest. Any further questions? You can also raise your hand. If not, I suggest we continue, and I also have time for Q&A at the end. So now we talked a lot about regulations and scopes and OECD and UNGPs, the term human rights due diligence. What is it, Jorinka?
Well, in short, human rights due diligence is about avoiding negative impacts on people and the environment along the value chain of a company. And how this can be implemented, we will discuss now. To start, I will give you a short overview of the 6 elements, the 6 key elements of human rights due diligence, with some examples of what questions a company should ask itself about the different steps. So the first element, the policy commitment, here it's about how a company can credibly express that it is committed to respect human rights. The human rights risk and impact assessment, here it's about how a company can identify its human rights risks and impacts, and also how to prioritize the most severe salient issues. Then the element of risk-based measures is about how a company can identify and prioritize and then also implement effective risk-based measures with the aim of seizing, preventing, or mitigating negative impacts. The element of embedding respect for human rights is also very, very central. And here it's about how a company can successfully embed and integrate the whole concept of human rights due diligence into its existing business processes. Then tracking and communicating. Here it's about how a company can monitor the effectiveness of the measures it has taken, and also how it can communicate transparently about its impact and also about how it deals with its impacts. And then lastly, the element of grievance and remedy. Here it is about what the company needs to establish an effective grievance mechanism and how a company can use it to identify human rights issues in case something has happened, and then also to provide effective remedies. Now, yes, Matthias?
So what we then quite often see is that starting with the first element, and we will guide you now through the different elements, is that many companies have already sustainability policies that define goals and approaches, and we often get the question whether this would be then already compliant with their international regulations. So what is needed when we talk about policies?
Well, that depends on the content and the adoption process of the policy. In principle, different types of commitments are possible. For example, it can be a standalone policy. It can also be an integrated policy commitment together with other sustainability topics. However, the international standards do make different demands on the adoption process, on the scope, and on the content. For example, on process and dissemination of the policy, here a requirement is that it is approved at the most senior level of the company, as we've already also heard earlier by Matthias regarding the Swiss law. And then another important requirement is that it is publicly available and communicated to relevant stakeholders along the value chain. And regarding scope and content, also coming back to your question, how to decide whether a sustainability policy, for example, fulfills the international standards. Here, it depends. For example, one should check whether the policy defines the entire value chain as a scope, and also whether the most important international standards are being mentioned. I also brought an example of a policy commitment. They can often be a very valuable source of information for a company that wants to develop a policy. However, it's very important that the policy always needs to be very much adapted to a specific company's context. Here, the example is from ABN AMRO, a Dutch bank, and its human rights statement covers many key elements of human rights due diligence. For example, the statement describes how they work to meet international standards, how they prioritize their salient human rights issues. They describe the governance structure and how they take action, how they track the performance, so the monitoring part. They talk about how they handle transparency, how they provide remedy, and also who has approved the policy. Another central element of human rights due diligence is then, as the second element, the risk and impact analysis. And here it's really about identifying the potential and actual negative impacts on human rights and the environment at a very high level. And here it's very important to focus on those potentially or actually affected. And this typically requires a change in risk perspective, so not to take the traditional corporate perspective of risk to the business, but rather really to focus on the risk to people. And there are certain requirements also here that all human rights are considered, that the company looks at the entire value chain and at different potentially affected parties, that experts are being consulted, and then a very central element is also the prioritization of risks. Here you see on the right side an exemplary matrix with the two key concepts based on which a company can identify and prioritize its salient issues. This is the severity of impacts and the likelihood. We will hear a little bit more about that later. And then lastly, it's also very important that it's not a one-off exercise, but that the company really includes a process that foresees regular repetition. Now, in order to show the concrete procedure, how such a risk analysis can be implemented, I welcome Matthias Leisinger. He will now take the position of the CEO of our fictive case company, Swiss Textile Limited. Matthias, can you briefly introduce the company, please?
Thank you, Jorinka. Yes, I will briefly present my fictive company. I'm the CEO of the Swiss Textile Ltd, based in Switzerland, where we also are headquartered. We have roughly 1,200 employees in Switzerland and globally with more than 8,500 people. We are a medium-sized Swiss textile company. We have different branches for sales. So we mainly sell in Germany, France, and Austria. We do not have our own production factories, but our production is mainly in India, Bangladesh, and in Turkey, based on subcontracting and working with producers and traders. We have started to implement human rights due diligence in the company a few years ago. This was mainly due to incidents in our supply chain. So we heard from NGOs and civil society organizations. We had cases of child labor in second and third tier supply chains. But nowadays we also face increased expectations of our customers in the B2B sector. So that's why we are implementing, or try to implement actually, systematic human rights due diligence process. And in this context, we have also carried out an overarching risk assessment.
Okay. And can you explain how you implemented this risk analysis?
Yes, I try. So what we did is basically used simple three-step approach. This looks now simple, but obviously there's much more work behind it. In the first step, we mapped out our value chain. So we collected basic information of all steps along the value chain, including activities and relevant actors. In second step, we started mapping out and identifying potential human rights risks along the whole value chain. And then in a first step, we prioritized the salient human rights risks based on the criteria outlined also in different regulations, but also in the UNGPs based on scale, scope, and irremediability. We will come back and explain this a little bit in more detail.
Okay, thank you very much. So you applied those 3 steps, and what came out of that process of those 3 steps?
So what we did, as mentioned in the first step, we looked into our value chain and started mapping it out in 6 steps. So basically starting from the cotton production, where we looked into what are the key activities in terms of cotton production. The next element, the processing. The processing includes the fiber production, wet processing, and textile finishing. Added the element of transport, but also the agents, because transportation often gets forgotten when we look into our supply chain. Also aggregated transportation, because we know obviously that there much more transportation is needed through the different value chain elements. Then we have looked into our own company, our own shops, our headquarters, but also looked into our franchise partners. And last but not least, we also looked into the element of reusing, recycling of textile, which also becomes a much more important element when we talk about textile value chains nowadays. So I think what was new to us was that we looked into the entire value chain. So traditionally, companies and also we have a focus on our supply chain. So that is one element that was new. And the second element that was also new to us was that traditionally we looked more into the tier 1 suppliers, sometimes tier 2 in our supply chain management, because that's where we had the information, where we had the knowledge, where we had the context. But looking at the entire value chain was certainly not always easy, and we also had obviously internal challenges because quite often we simply don't know where the cotton, for example, is coming from.
Okay, so you applied this whole value chain view and developed this value chain map with those 6 steps, with these 6 value chain elements. What did you do with that next?
So I think what we did is that we decided nevertheless to focus on the upstream supply chain for the identification of risks, knowing that, and we are aware that we have also in the future, we have to take a closer look at the downstream supply chain. But I think that was an important first step. So looking into more the upstream value chain. Then in the next exercise, we identified potential human rights risks for each element of the value chain, step by step. So the potential human rights risks that could occur along the value chain, having the human rights lens, focusing on potentially affected person. So we asked ourselves who is potentially affected by which negative impact. So as you can see, this list is quite long. When we looked into the agricultural production, we have the topic of forced labor, child labor, environmental impacts on communities, transportation, obviously, working conditions on ships and in shipping, working conditions, long working hours in logistics, discrimination, equal salary, equal pay when it comes to retail in our own shop and franchising partners. But that's how we looked into the value chain and started mapping out potential human rights risks.
Okay, and you mentioned that you don't really have traceability on the further up the value chain. So, for example, for the agricultural production. So how without having that traceability, how did you actually come across these topics? What sources did you use?
First of all, it's a lot of common sense. I mean, it's not difficult to realize that in the cotton supply chain, you face the risk of environmental impacts by using pesticides. You have the potential risk of child labor. But then we also used a lot of relevant internal information. So I think key information we got from internal people, audit, quality, procurement. That was certainly an important source of information. So every company knows much more than you would expect about the whole supply chain and or value chain. But then we also looked into external sources. You can find a few links here. When we talked about child labor, for example, there is this already quoted UNICEF and Child Rights and Business Atlas, which looks into risks, not only in terms of child rights, but goes much broader. There is the CSO risk check that looks into country risks, but also sector risks. So there's a lot of publicly available information out there. You can start looking for more country-specific information. Sometimes you have more sector-specific information. Sometimes you have both. So it's some desktop research, but it's also a lot of common sense when doing this kind of work. So, and as a starting point, as mentioned, we considered all human rights risks, looking into the perspective and the lens of the potentially affected group, as Jolinka mentioned already. So, as a CEO, we tend to look more into the company perspective. So what is the impact of a risk on the reputation, on operational risks, on financial risks? But now with the human rights lens, you have to have kind of changing the lenses and look more into the human rights risks and the potentially affected groups. I think that was important and otherwise easy.
So now you had this big list of issues along the whole value chain that you identified based on all those different possible sources of information. How did you prioritize now? I mean, I guess it's difficult to know where to start if you have so many issues that you could potentially tackle.
Just there's one question in the chat. I see who should be involved in the risk assessment for step 1, 2, 3. I think it's typically we see it is internal organizations or functions such as procurement, quality management, partly sales. Certainly you need the top management commitment and will to do this kind of work. So there are different internal resources. Audit quite often is an important source of information. Compliance, as we see it more and more moving into the compliance team. So to find information internally, I would say it's procurement, partly sales, depending on the organization, audit, quality management as key internal stakeholders. And then to set up and to anchor the whole system, you certainly need the top management, you need compliance, you need also human resources usually has a lot of information. So the key internal functions might be that ones. So coming back to your question, so when you start mapping out the whole long list of potential risks, it sounds overwhelming. It's like, okay, what can we do now as a company? And I think here, that's one key element why we quite often also work on the prioritization. Is important that you would then prioritize the identified risks along the supply chain based on the criteria as they're also outlined in international frameworks, which is the scale, so the impact on a human right. So how important is the negative impact on the human right? The scope, which is the sheer number of people affected, and the question of irremediability. So what is the possibility to remediate the impacts and in how much time? So that's how you can prioritize potential human rights risks.
Matthias, one question in the chat relates to the issues that are listed here in the map now, environmental impacts. The question is whether environmental topics really are part of human rights due diligence. What would you say here?
I think, again, taking this human lens helps a lot. So what are environmental impacts that have a negative impact or potential negative impact on communities? So it can be pesticides, it can be negative impacts on access to water, for example. We see nowadays more and more also the link between climate change and human rights being discussed. Water pollution is certainly a topic. So usually we look into environmental impacts, how they might impact or negatively impact the surrounding communities and people. So those are environmental impacts impacting communities. You can also look into fishing communities, for example. So there are a lot of potential environmental impacts that have a direct or indirect impact, obviously, on communities. So that's a little bit how we look into environmental impacts. So yes, they are usually part of a human rights due diligence aspect. It's not about, I don't know, circular economy or plastic or whatever, but always if environmental impacts are impacting communities and people, we would consider them in a human rights due diligence management system.
Thank you. Now, this approach that you described of how you looked at these issues to prioritize them, how does this approach differ from how you've looked at human rights and environmental risks in the past?
I think the key difference is that companies are used to working in those kind of matrices in color codes, and that's how we usually work in companies. So if you see a red flag, it's not good. You have to do something. So that's why we also work in terms of human rights with this heat map. And again, the key difference is that the focus of when you do the risk assessment is on the risk for the potentially affected persons, the so-called rights holders, and not the risk for the company and the CEO of. So the severity based on those three criteria defined here is considered regardless of the company's leverage. I think it's important that a topic can be severe, and we'll talk about this in a minute, without having a lot of influence. And that's also the key questions, what can you do about it?
So how did you arrive at those estimates of those high, medium, and low severity?
Just to give you a brief example. So the health of workers, for example, in the cotton fields, in the agricultural production, they are exposed to chemicals, they have health problems, and probably long-term development deficits. So the scale is, the negative impact is quite big, even though probably then the number, the sheer number of people affected might be limited. So that's why we put it red. For example, we talk about health and safety in the agricultural production. And as you can see, there's still a lot of red, and there's still a lot of red in the upstream value chain. So basically, there you have, as a company, little influence. And I think that's why, in the next step, it's also important to look into, again, further prioritizing those issues. And we do this usually with those two axes. One is the severity and the likelihood. And this is not, it's not mathematics. It's you need a certain level of abstraction. So it's kind of a high level view you have to take. And I think that's important, that it's not hard science. So, but based on this abstraction, on this risk assessment, you can then identify concrete measures and address the human rights, address other issues you have prioritized. And Jolinka now will tell a bit more about what you can do, even though if you have limited influence on a potential human rights risk.
Yes, I will happy to do that in a second. First, Matthias, I would like to take up a question from the chat. So for the prioritization, in addition to these different elements of the textile value chain, would you also recommend to take into account the geographical location? For example, differences in Turkey, Bangladesh versus India, or how to go about that? I think
it certainly can help if you have a lot of information. But what we usually would do is to have a more, I mean, if you have a lot of information, obviously you can then focus on Turkey, Bangladesh, and India. But in a first instance, it might help just to have even a more higher level in terms of risk assessment, to better understand what the potential risks in the supply chain in this context are. Obviously, you can use country-based information, as a lot of sources showed earlier, provide those country information. But at the end, a textile supply chain has similar risks, whether you would source from Turkey, India, Bangladesh. Obviously, yes, there are the specifications. For example, you have the risk of refugee works now of Syrian refugees working, for example, in Turkey, in the textile, but you would have similar risks also in Bangladesh. So having a little bit a more generic overview might help right from the beginning. But yes, of course, if you have information, you can take also geographical specific information into consideration.
Thank you. I see there's a lot of good questions coming in. I suggest we continue now and focus on the other questions later. There will be another Q&A. So after this risk analysis that Matthias just presented, the next element of human rights due diligence is taking risk-based measures with the aim to either stop, ideally, or prevent, and if this is not possible, to mitigate salient impacts. And what is important here is that this requirement is regardless of the company's level of influence. For example, if a risk is severe and the company has little influence, it is required that measures are taken. And in general, they should be developed along the whole value chain, that is upstream and downstream, and also within the own company. And the measures should take into account the possibility of influence and degree of involvement. So whether a company causes or contributes to an impact through its business relationships. And here you see also this graph, which shows that it is important to consider the nature of the impact. So if there is a potential impact, the requirement is that measures are taken to prevent or mitigate this potential impact. And in cases of an actual impact that has already occurred, measures should be taken to redress impact, so also taking remedy. And now, for example, the case of Swiss textile, we heard about the risk of child labor on cotton fields. This would be directly linked to products of the Swiss Textile Limited, because the cotton produced in this way is processed in its products. And here the company should then use its influence, even if it's not a lot of influence because it's very high up the value chain and maybe there is no traceability. It should still use its influence to avoid or mitigate negative impacts. For example, here it can be by cooperating with suppliers, or also using sector initiatives to respond to such an impact. And to implement all those such measures, a person that is, for example, responsible for the risk analysis or for developing measures is typically heavily dependent on other functions. We heard that earlier as well from Matthias. So what is it about regarding embedding, Matthias?
Yeah, I think as for many other management systems, it's important to say it does not come without resources and costs. So if you want to do this within a company, you just have to allocate resources. And that's why it's extremely important that you, first of all, get the top management commitment right for the beginning. And what we usually see is that it is important that there are clear responsibilities assigned within a company, depending, again, on the company context, on the company setup, also having the appropriate functions defined. Then I think in terms of processes, it's important that you look into what is already here. We talked a lot about supply chain management. Training, awareness raising, certainly a key aspect. And as in many other sustainability topics, it's a cross-functional collaboration. So you cannot operate in a silo. So you have to develop solutions together with other departments, functions, and also processes. And then you need certainly some sort of a governance structure. Again, this is depending on the company size and context, but you have to make sure that the board of directors, the top management, get some sort of information every year or in a regular update. But also, for example, what we see certainly in large corporations, the internal audit processes, the assurance processes that are established in companies can help a lot. And we just brought you a small example here that illustrates it here, is that, for example, ABB, they have established kind of a network of human rights champions across the groups. I think a few of them are here also in the webinar today, and have developed a very systematic approach in terms of human rights trainings with clear targets, aims, and also the responsible functions. I think that's a good kind of example how you can make sure that the whole organization understands the ambition level, understands what the company wants to achieve in terms of human rights diligence, and know what they can do in their respective function. I mean, for small SMEs, or for SMEs, obviously, it is not always appropriate to set up such a whole system, but usually every company, they have existing trainings. They do training of new employees, they do training of existing employees, and you easily can integrate here elements and content in terms of human rights to those existing training, just to make sure that, again, here you can start embedding and integrating human rights within your organization. I think that's just one short example here. Then the next element, Jolinka, is the monitoring part. How can companies monitor that they are right on track?
Yeah. Well, here it's about monitoring the effectiveness of the measures taken to address potential human rights risks and other measures taken. And here, what is very important is that the company consults affected stakeholders and that their feedback is incorporated in the evaluation process. And particular focus should also be on particularly vulnerable groups, to really focus on their needs and their situation. And then there are requirements on other aspects that are rather similar to general internal monitoring processes that companies are very much used to. For example, to define appropriate quantitative and qualitative indicators and to integrate the monitoring into existing processes, such as, for example, employee surveys. And then the communication part is really about creating transparency towards within the own corporation, but also externally, about how risks are being handled and how the measures are being taken. And here we see that the requirements are also increasing, for example, with the new GRI standards. Very quick, I will not go into detail here. We have two practice examples. For example, Unilever, in their human rights report, they communicate about their salient issues. And what we really see, there's a lot of communication dilemmas still within the companies on how much to communicate, and certain groups are afraid to communicate on difficult topics because they're afraid of potential reputational consequences, but we really see a trend towards more transparency. And then the last element of human rights due diligence, the grievance and remedy. Here it's about the establishment of a so-called effective grievance mechanism, and there is effectiveness criteria also set forth by the UNGPs that a grievance mechanism must meet in order to be effective. For example, that it should be accessible, so that, for example, children working in the cotton fields also really have access and not just a whistleblowing hotline that is accessible to own employees. Yes, Matthias, do you want to wrap up how to start? What is important?
Excellent. Thank you, Jolinka. So we heard a lot about what human rights diligence is. There's still a few questions in the chat, and we will stay another 5 to 10 minutes to address certain specific questions just afterwards. But I just want to wrap up and give you some sort of what's next. So how can you start? And are there any specifications for SMEs? So again, it's from our perspective, it's certainly worthwhile to take the international standards as we have described them, those core elements of the process, as the framework to define the overarching human rights due diligence management system. So usually companies start in assigning responsibilities in a first step that set the strategic direction, the oversight, but also basically are the ones who set then the ambition level. In the second step, you should, and companies usually establish this overarching human rights management system to ensure that basically, throughout the process, you can build competences. You need expertise, you need internal expertise, you need partly external expertise, you need access to network, you need probably information from sector initiatives. So building internal competences is key to have this internal management system working at the end. And what in a first step then often happens is that companies would start assessing where they are compared to legal and or international requirements. Because quite a lot of companies, they have already established processes in terms of health and safety, in terms of diversity and inclusion. So there is quite often already something that can be built upon, being it in HR, being it in quality management, being it in contracting. And in the first step, what is quite often done is looking into those 6 core elements and then understand in more details where the specific company stands against the international requirements and the legal requirements as they have described. And then you can basically decide and define as your company whether you just want to be legally compliant, what your ambition level is, what your reference framework is. But usually having such a gap assessment to start with is certainly a good starting point from the beginning. And then quite often is what we see, sometimes this goes hand in hand with the gap assessment, is that companies would then also do a risk assessment along the supply chain or the value chain, excuse me, as we just have described, to understand in more details the salient human rights risks for the respective companies. So that's usually where companies can start. What is different, or is there any difference from large corporations to SMEs? This question often arises when you have discussions with companies. Actually, there are probably not too many differences. So, as outlined right at the beginning, also the expectation in Switzerland set out from the Swiss Federation is that all companies have to respect human rights, depending or not depending necessarily on their size. So it's really outlined also in the UNGPs actually that all companies have to respect human rights. What is different sometimes, but that's also different between large corporations, depending on the context, depending on the business model, depending on the supplier relationship, depending on the complexity of supply chains. Obviously, human rights due diligence, the whole setup of the management system can be different between large corporations and SMEs, but also can be different between two large corporations, depending on their context they are operating in. So there's not too many specifications. Obviously, internally, there are different resources. You have to adapt the system to the internal resources, to the internal organizations. So you have to adapt the system to the company size, to the risk disposition, to the business activity, but also to the way you operate as a company. Last but not least, I think it's, as in all or many management systems, it's continuous improvement. So it's not the goal and the aim that you are perfect. It is learning by doing, step by step, understanding your risks, step by step, improving processes, identify and prioritize and work on the prioritized risks and salient human rights issues. So it is a continuous improvement process, and probably the most important step is just to get started somewhere and somehow. So in summary, as Jolinka said at the beginning, the goal is to avoid negative impacts on human rights that the company is directly or indirectly causing through its own operations or through business relationship. Human rights is quite often a more systematic approach to the S of CSR, to the S of ESG. It has this new risk perspective. It is important that you take measures and identify measures based on the prioritized risks, but you cannot say, I cannot do anything because I do not know my supplier in the tier 4 supply chain. So you have to identify measures depending on the leverage. And it is really a process of continuous improvement rather than just being perfect. Also here, the Global Compact has certain tools and e-learnings and publications available. And with this, I would quickly like to hand over back to Alice. I would like to thank you for the active participation. We will share the slides, and as mentioned, we will also stay here in the room for another 10-15 minutes to address open questions. So thanks a lot. Have a lovely afternoon, and back to Alice.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thanks a lot, Jolinka, as well, for the very insightful webinar. Yes, just as you mentioned, so we have a few e-learnings, we have publications, tools. We recommend the Business and Human Rights Navigator that you also have on the slide. Yes, you will receive the slide so you can have a look at these links. We have a new business and human rights working group together with Focusrite in the context of the NAP, so that you also see on the slide. Yes, please have a look on the presentation that we will send you. I won't take more time, so that if someone is still willing to stay and ask the question, I see there is one that has not been answered, then you can do so. But I would like to wish everyone a very nice afternoon, and thanks a lot again, Jolinka, Matthias, and also Anna for the presentations.